Hello again, everyone. I hope you enjoyed our third film, a little known vampire film called Dracula's Daughter from 1936. It's actually somewhat well known to people that know film history and know vampire films. And in fact, if you buy the Dracula Anthology DVD, Dracula's Daughter is one of the movies included. So it's not completely unknown to audiences, but not one of the more famous Dracula films. So, Dracula's Daughter is meant to be a direct sequel to Dracula. And we're going to actually see several films that spawned sequels throughout this course. And sequels are important to understand when we talk about movies. Sequels are made sometimes because they're really good. You could think of the Star Wars movies or even some of the Lord of the Rings movies as good examples of sequels that are very well done. But what sequels do is they rely actually on a built-in audience. So you know the audience went to the first one and you kind of assume that they will go see the sequel. That's of course not always true. But I remember absolutely hating the first Matrix movie and then hating myself that I was going to have to see two more of these, which I absolutely did, and hated the second and third more than I hated the first. But ultimately, the sequel, I was the built-in audience, and I saw all three of those movies. And we'll see the forthcoming Star Wars movies and the Lord of the Rings movies. So I'm a really good example of the built-in audience. Dracula as a film had several sequels. Ultimately, sometimes when you're making a sequel, you include some of the same characters. So you could see Dr. Van Helsing is played by the same actor as he did in the first Dracula movie. And you can see that in sequels, they try to sometimes visually tie back to the original. So this staircase is supposed to be from the original Dracula. It never quite looked like that, but they made a direct connection between the staircase at the end of Dracula and the staircase at the beginning of Dracula's Daughter. Despite this film being called Dracula's Daughter, Dracula really doesn't appear in it. This is really the only shot of Dracula that we see. And that, of course, is not Bela Lugosi. And Bela Lugosi, according to the Internet Movie Database, actually made a little bit of money off of Dracula's Daughter. He got to participate in some of the publicity, but he never appeared in Dracula's Daughter. In fact, Dracula himself really doesn't appear in Dracula's Daughter. So when we're thinking about sequels, Dracula spawned a few sequels. There's Son of Dracula, House of Dracula. These are a couple of the more famous Dracula sequels. And then down here at the bottom, there are a bunch of other Dracula sequels, some of which you're probably not familiar with. In fact, most you're not familiar with. This bottom group all starred Peter Cushing as Dr. Van Helsing. So one of the things, much like Dr. Van Helsing's, the actor appeared in both Dracula's Daughter and Dracula, Peter Cushing made a career out of playing Dr. Van Helsing. After his career in Dracula movies, Peter Cushing went on to play Grand Moff Tarkin in the original Star Wars movie. If you're a fan of the movie, you'll recognize him. He wasn't a huge role in that film, but this is one of the ones that made him more famous. If you're familiar with Christopher Lee, who was also a future Star Wars alumnus, he made a career out of actually playing Dracula. So these are some examples of Christopher Lee's Dracula films, and some of these also starred Peter Cushing as Dr. Van Helsing. So again, a little bit of continuity there. Christopher Lee would go on to play Count Dooku and Darth Tyrannus in the Star Wars prequels, so you can see him there. You might be even more familiar with him as Saruman the White in the Lord of the Rings movies. So there he is there, and he was in two of the three Lord of the Rings movies. So Dracula's been good to people. People made their careers out of Dracula and went on to do some good things. Bela Lugosi, not so much. So in the article we read about Manly Hall's film sequel to Dracula, Manly Hall was trying to make, for lack of a better term, a sequel to Dracula, and not all that creatively titled sequel to Dracula. The 1930s horror film continued, these sequels continued the storyline of these films. So what we saw, you see a fair amount of continuity between the original and the sequels. Sequels draw direct connections to previous films, but still try to explain a little bit of what's going on so that audiences understand even if they didn't see the original. But I would argue that most people that see sequels saw the original at some point, whether it was in the theaters or... So as noted in the article, Hall had some challenges as he was trying to make sequel to Dracula, which ultimately he never made. There was a brief ban on the horror film genre in the United States in the 30s. Didn't last very long, but that was due in part to a British ban on the genre. Hall refused to acknowledge Dracula's daughter in his narrative of sequel to Dracula, which is odd because Dracula's daughter had already occurred. Bela Lugosi, as we know, developed some pretty serious problems in his career, and ultimately it was his drug problem that was the most serious roadblock to getting sequel to Dracula made if Bela Lugosi was to be a part of it. Hall wanted to utilize Stoker's letter diary structure that Wood has pointed out as being problematic, and we'll see in some of our later vampire films. And ultimately, he was a little ahead of his time. He wanted to make what we would commonly think of as a postmodern film. When a film acknowledges its origins, or when a piece of popular culture acknowledges itself and really calls attention to the fact that it's a piece of popular culture, we think of that as postmodern. So if you think of Seinfeld, if you were a fan of Seinfeld, occasionally Jerry would say something like, "Would you like a Snapple?" Which is a kind of an odd thing to say, even if he was drinking Snapple. He was making reference to a piece of popular culture. Snapple was very popular during the airing of Seinfeld. And what Hall wanted his characters to do was to actually make reference to the novel Dracula in the course of the Dracula film. And that was going to be a problem probably at this point in history. There were not a lot of postmodern films being made at this time. So it's also important to acknowledge black and white filmmaking. Dracula's Daughter is our last black and white film. Prince discusses black and white films in a few chapters, and you can see them there, 2, 3, 7, and 10. So when we're talking about black and white films, really one of the things that we need to focus on is color. And Prince makes some distinctions between some different lighting color issues, and you need to know the difference between hue, saturation, and intensity. And in black and white films, the scale of colors is referred to as the grayscale. You see that term thrown around from time to time. You can see it if you do any kind of photo editing on computers. There's an option to put things in the grayscale, and that would simply mean the scale of colors goes essentially from white to black, with most of the colors in the middle being gray. So what happens when you're making a black and white film, you might have objects that are different colors, and we think of colors as hue. But if their intensity, their brightness is the same, despite them having different colors, they will look the same in a black and white film. So some people see a black and white film and think that the filmmaker was being lazy. But it's actually very difficult to make a black and white film, and there are lots of things that you need to keep in mind in terms of lighting, color, what people are wearing, how sets are designed, and you have to think about those things in black and white films in a different way than you have to think about them when making a color film. So Prince outlines the filmmaking process early in the book, and I'm not going to go through each of these individual aspects of pre-production, production, and post-production. But what's important to keep in mind is that the filmmaking process is a long process. It's not as though someone picks up a camera one day and goes and shoots a film and it's done. So there's a fair amount of pre-production. There's writing of the script, there's editing of the script, there's casting. We have to think about set design, costumes. You have to actually rehearse. I mean, people don't just show up and make a film. They actually have to practice a little bit. So there's a lot that goes into the filmmaking process before the first scene is even shot. The production process, while long and for some films can be very, very long, is not necessarily the longest part of filmmaking, though it often is. So that's, the actual shooting of the scenes, the actual recording, traveling to the set, traveling to location shots. So if you're doing a location shot, you've gone somewhere to shoot something. And then once you've shot film, you're still not done. You have post-production. You have to edit all of this material. You have to add music and sound effects. Now, we have a great deal of digital editing, so we have to add digital effects and coloring, and so there's actually quite a bit that goes into the filmmaking process, and it's important to know everything that goes into each of the three phases of filmmaking production that Prince describes. So Dracula's Daughter is our first film that has a significant amount of what we would call comic relief. So you've probably heard that term thrown around, but we think of comic relief as something that kind of gives us a break in the middle of something heavy. Dracula's Daughter can be at times a heavy movie, but it does have a fair amount of kind of over-the-top jokes. So you had these two kind of goofy police officers in the beginning. You have the relationship, the kind of sexual tension that goes on for much of the film. You have the joke that's played when she pretends to be someone that she's not, and then this guy gets caught up in the middle. You have, I'm not sure what he's doing in this scene. He's collecting stamps, or I don't know, but it's odd for the head of Scotland Yard to be portrayed in this way and kind of in bed doing arts and crafts while his butler comes in. There's, of course, the whole tying of the bow tie scene, and then this kind of ambiguously sexed, sexualized butler who's clearly, in this period of time, being framed as kind of not heterosexual. And there's a whole strain of literature called queer theory, and queer doesn't necessarily mean homosexual, but in this particular case, this character is being coded as queer. And you'll see that there is that kind of queer character pops up in 1930s, 40s, 50s films all the time. And they're often in subservient roles. So here he's a butler, but you can often think of them as people working in the service industry, fashion designers. You'll see them again and again in other films that we won't be watching for this course. Vampire movies really like to make jokes with words, and we'll see that again and again. So you'll see when she arrives at the party, this woman comes up to her and says, "My guests are dying to meet you." That's not an accident. So that's kind of a joke, an in-joke that you're supposed to get because she's talking to a vampire. So I don't know how many of you noticed Sandor's striking resemblance to Benicio del Toro. They are not related, but I can't help but look at Irving Pitchell and think of Benicio del Toro, but they are in fact not the same person, separated by many decades. So we've talked about shadows before, and Dracula's Daughter really emphasizes shadows in a way that goes beyond even some of our other films that we've watched so far. So here's a good scene, and you can see the shadow in the background is very, very prominent. That's not an accident. You can see here half of Sandor's face is covered in a kind of shadow. You can see here he's lurking in the shadows. He's almost invisible because he's blending into the shadows. It's, if you didn't look closely, you'd only see his head. Here you see, again, half of a face covered in shadows. For the Countess, I'd like to think that it's kind of a light, dark motif, that she's not all bad, that she's got some good in her, but ultimately she's still a vampire and has to be destroyed. And then, of course, this is one scene that I found in particular. There's just shadows everywhere. It's barely a scene without shadows. And then, again, at this point, she's a pretty dark character, so the shadows have kind of taken over. I thought it might be useful to talk for a moment about what female sexuality looked like in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So when we see Gloria Holden, the star of Dracula's Daughter, she doesn't necessarily look like what we think of as a kind of sexualized woman in modern film. But I wanted to show you some other examples of film stars of the time. And you can see that they look a little different than our female stars of today. And ultimately, they had some very striking features: broad shoulders. They were less super thin than current female stars. But I wanted to show you these examples to assure you that Gloria Holden and the actresses of the time were in fact sex symbols and were in fact highly sexualized. So they just look a little different than what we see today and what we will see in some of our later films in this course. So before we leave the 1930s, it's important to talk about the Hays Code, which was a code, a kind of informal code regulating films in the 1930s through really the 60s is when the Hays Code really fell away. And it was this kind of voluntary thing that the studios did to censor themselves. And the Hays Code was designed to limit what they termed as offensive material, which could include sexuality, violence, any references to homosexuality. And some people actually argue that Dracula's Daughter is a really good example of someone trying to work around the Hays Code. So you couldn't really have lesbians in film in the 1930s, but you could depict a vampire as a kind of lesbian. Though she seems to be both attracted to men and women, many readings of this film have suggested that that the Countess is being portrayed as a lesbian. So one, that let you get a lesbian on film at the same time, or at least a lesbian narrative, at the same time she had to be punished as part of the Hays Code, and in this case she was killed. But people with kind of alternative sexualities in the films of the Hays Code period often were punished by death or jail. They never made it to the ends of the films kind of in one piece, so to speak. So what are the key takeaways of Dracula's Daughter? Well, first, Dracula's Daughter was a direct sequel to Dracula. That's important to keep in mind. Second, Dracula's Daughter employs many of the same visual and narrative techniques as Dracula, so the connections are not just in title and in sequence, but they are connected visually and through the story. Directors in the black and white era really had to think about things like lighting, sets, and costumes in a way that we don't think about now. Not that there isn't considerable thought put into lighting, sets, and costumes now, but in the black and white era, more thought had to be put into them so that they appeared distinct on the screen. The production process for films is complex and doesn't end once the film is shot. And Manley Hall was never able to make sequel to Dracula for the reasons that are discussed in the article and that we've discussed here.